What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? Make sure to subscribe to Prime Talk and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. The segment begins in a way that feels familiar to anyone who regularly watches late-night television. Stephen Colbert sits behind his desk, composed and slightly amused, setting the tone with a brief monologue about the current political climate in the United States. The audience responds with light laughter at his opening remarks, especially as he touches on ongoing tensions surrounding the Trump administration's past foreign policy decisions and the broader conversation about Iran. It's not overly intense at first, more observational, the kind of commentary viewers expect at the start of the show. As Colbert transitions into introducing his guest, Senator John Kerry, the energy in the room shifts subtly. There's a level of anticipation. Kerry, a former Secretary of State with extensive experience in diplomacy, particularly regarding Iran, walks onto the stage to steady applause. His demeanor is calm, measured, and professional. He shakes Colbert's hand, exchanges a brief greeting, and takes his seat. At first, the conversation stays within expected boundaries. Colbert opens with a general question about the current state of U.S. foreign policy and how it compares to previous administrations. Kerry responds in a thoughtful and deliberate manner, speaking about the importance of alliances, diplomacy, and long-term strategy. His tone is even, and he avoids inflammatory language. The audience listens closely, with occasional nods and scattered applause. Colbert, maintaining his usual conversational style, follows up with a question that begins to steer the discussion toward more specific territory. He references the Trump administration's decision to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal, framing it as a turning point in U.S.-Iran relations. His phrasing is casual but pointed, something along the lines of asking whether that decision, in Kerry's view, made the world safer or more unstable. Kerry pauses briefly before answering. It's a noticeable pause, not overly long, but enough to signal that he is choosing his words carefully. He begins by explaining the original intent of the nuclear deal, emphasizing that it was designed to limit Iran's nuclear capabilities through verification and international cooperation. His voice remains steady, and he leans slightly forward as he speaks, signaling engagement. As Kerry continues, the audience grows quieter. He outlines how the agreement was structured and the role it played in reducing tensions at the time. He avoids directly criticizing individuals at first, instead focusing on the policy itself. Colbert listens attentively, occasionally nodding, but his posture suggests he is preparing to challenge, or at least probe deeper. The first subtle shift in tone comes when Colbert interjects, not abruptly, but with a sense of urgency. He acknowledges Kerry's explanation but asks whether the deal, even at its best, may have only delayed rather than prevented long-term conflict. The question is framed in a way that invites debate rather than agreement. Kerry responds by clarifying that diplomacy often works in stages. He emphasizes that preventing immediate escalation is, in itself, a meaningful achievement. His tone remains composed, but there's a slight firmness now, a hint that he's defending not just a policy, but a broader philosophy of international relations. The audience reaction becomes more mixed at this point. Some nod in agreement with Kerry's perspective, while others respond more actively to Colbert's framing of the issue. It's not a divided room, but there's a noticeable shift from passive listening to engaged reaction. Acknowledgement that the situation is complex. He notes that actions taken by any administration have consequences, both immediate and long-term. His language becomes more precise, and there's a subtle change in pacing, slower, more deliberate. As he speaks, Colbert leans back slightly, giving Kerry space to elaborate. The audience remains attentive, with occasional murmurs of agreement. Kerry explains that withdrawing from agreements without a clear alternative can create uncertainty, and in regions like the Middle East, uncertainty often leads to escalation. This is where the conversation begins to take on a slightly more tense edge. It's not confrontational in the traditional sense, but there's a clear difference in perspective emerging. Colbert listens, but his facial expression shifts, less amused, more focused. He follows up by asking whether Kerry believes there was ever a realistic path to renegotiating a stronger deal, as some had argued at the time. The question is phrased in a neutral way, but it carries an implicit challenge. Kerry responds by saying that diplomacy is rarely about immediate results. He suggests that walking away from a framework without sustained engagement reduces the chances of improvement. His tone remains controlled, but there's a subtle emphasis on certain words, indicating conviction. At this point, the audience begins to respond more audibly. Light applause at certain points, particularly when Kerry emphasizes the importance of dialogue over confrontation. Colbert acknowledges the reaction with a slight smile, but quickly returns to the discussion. The pacing of the segment has noticeably slowed compared to the beginning. What started as a routine interview has become a more serious exchange, with both participants carefully choosing their words. There's no raised voices, no overt conflict, but the tension is present in the pauses, the follow-up questions, and the shift in body language. Colbert leans forward again, signaling another question, and this time he frames it in a broader context, asking how the U.S. should approach Iran moving forward, given the current geopolitical realities. It's a question that invites both reflection and, potentially, disagreement. Kerry begins to answer, but there's a slight hesitation, as if he's anticipating where the conversation might go next. The audience senses it too, growing quieter once again. The exchange is no longer just informational. It's becoming a careful, measured discussion where each response carries weight. And it's at this point that the conversation moves from a calm policy discussion into something more layered, where differing perspectives are not just implied, but increasingly evident in how each point is addressed and challenged. As the conversation continues, the tone remains controlled, but there's a noticeable shift in how both Stephen Colbert and John Kerry engage with each other. What had started as a measured discussion of policy now begins to carry a sharper edge, not in volume or emotion, but in the precision of the questions and the careful framing of the answers. Colbert, leaning slightly forward with his hands resting on the desk, follows up on Kerry's last point about long-term diplomatic engagement. He acknowledges the value of stability, but raises a concern that resonates with a portion of the audience. Whether diplomacy, in this case, relied too heavily on assumptions about Iran's intentions. His wording is deliberate, suggesting that critics of the nuclear deal believed it may have underestimated risks rather than contained them. Kerry listens without interruption, maintaining eye contact, but his expression tightens just slightly. It's not confrontational, but there's a subtle indication that he recognizes the direction the conversation is heading. When Colbert finishes, there's a brief pause, long enough for the audience to anticipate a more pointed response. Kerry begins calmly, reiterating that diplomacy is never about certainty, but about managing risk. He explains that agreements like the nuclear deal are built on verification mechanisms, not trust alone. As he speaks, he gestures lightly with one hand, emphasizing key points without becoming animated. His tone remains steady, but there's a clearer sense of emphasis now, particularly when he references international inspectors and compliance reports. The audience reacts with a mix of quiet agreement and attentive silence. Some nod along, while others remain still, listening closely. It's the kind of moment where viewers can sense that the discussion is moving beyond general commentary into a more substantive exchange of perspectives. Colbert, picking up on this, shifts slightly in his chair and introduces a more direct angle. He references public skepticism that emerged during the Trump administration, noting that some policymakers argued the deal did not address other concerns, such as regional influence and missile development. His question is straightforward. Was the agreement too narrow in scope to truly prevent future conflict? This time, Kerry responds more quickly, as if he's addressed this point many times before. He acknowledges that no single agreement can resolve every issue at once, and he frames the nuclear deal as a starting point rather than a comprehensive solution. His tone remains composed, but there's a firmness in his delivery that wasn't as pronounced earlier. Colbert listens, but he doesn't immediately move on. Instead, he interjects briefly, not to interrupt, but to clarify. He asks whether focusing on one aspect, even if strategically sound, may have allowed other tensions to grow unchecked. The question is layered, and it shifts the conversation into a more analytical space. Kerry pauses again, this time slightly longer. He leans back a bit, taking a moment before responding. When he does, his voice is still calm, but there's a noticeable change in pacing. He speaks more slowly, choosing each word carefully. He explains that diplomacy often requires prioritization, and that attempting to address every issue simultaneously can lead to stalemate rather than progress. At this point, the audience begins to respond more visibly. There's a small round of applause from one section, followed by a quieter reaction from others. It's not disruptive, but it reflects a growing engagement with the discussion. Colbert acknowledges the reaction with a brief glance toward the audience, then turns back to Kerry with a slight nod. His next question brings the conversation closer to the present moment. He asks how current tensions, including the risk of military escalation, are influenced by decisions made in the past decade. The phrasing is careful, but it clearly invites Kerry to connect past policy with current realities. Kerry leans forward again, signaling engagement. He begins by noting that foreign policy decisions rarely exist in isolation. He explains that actions taken years ago can shape the environment in which current leaders operate. As he speaks, his tone becomes slightly more assertive, not aggressive, but more direct. He suggests that withdrawing from established agreements without a clear path forward can increase uncertainty, and that uncertainty, particularly in volatile regions, can lead to miscalculations. The word miscalculations stands out, and the audience reacts with a low murmur of acknowledgement. Colbert listens intently, but there's a subtle shift in his posture. He tilts his head slightly, as if weighing the response, and then follows up with a question that introduces a different perspective. He asks whether there's a risk of overstating the impact of any single decision, suggesting that tensions with Iran have existed across multiple administrations. This is where the exchange becomes more pointed. Kerry doesn't immediately respond. Instead, he takes a moment, his expression thoughtful but focused. When he begins speaking again, his tone remains calm, but there's a clearer sense of disagreement. He acknowledges that tensions have long existed, but emphasizes that policy choices can either mitigate or intensify those tensions. His wording is precise, and there's a slight emphasis on certain phrases, indicating that he is drawing a distinction rather than simply agreeing. The audience senses the shift. The room is quieter now, with fewer interruptions and more focused attention. It's the kind of silence that often accompanies a serious exchange, where viewers are listening closely to each point being made. Colbert, recognizing the seriousness of the moment, adjusts his approach slightly. His next question is less challenging in tone but still probing. He asks what lessons policymakers should take from the past when dealing with current and future conflicts. It's a broader question, but one that still carries weight. Kerry responds with a more reflective tone. He speaks about the importance of consistency, communication, and understanding the long-term consequences of decisions. His delivery is measured, and he avoids assigning blame directly, instead focusing on principles. As the segment moves into its final stretch, there's a noticeable awareness on both sides that the conversation has reached a point where it needs to be brought to a close without losing the substance that has built up over the past several minutes. Stephen Colbert maintains his composed posture, but his tone softens slightly, signaling a transition from direct questioning toward wrapping up the discussion. At the same time, John Kerry remains attentive, his expression steady, as if prepared for one final exchange. Colbert takes a brief pause before speaking again, allowing the moment to settle. He then reframes the conversation in a broader sense, acknowledging that discussions like this often continue beyond television studios and into public debate. He notes that viewers watching at home likely have strong opinions on the issues being discussed, whether it's the legacy of past foreign policy decisions, the role of diplomacy, or the current tensions involving Iran. He then asks Kerry a closing question, one that feels less confrontational but still meaningful. He asks what gives him confidence, if any, that future leadership, regardless of political party, can navigate these challenges more effectively. It's a question that invites reflection rather than debate, and it shifts the tone slightly away from disagreement. Kerry takes a moment before answering. His posture relaxes just a bit, and his voice, while still measured, carries a more reflective quality. He speaks about the resilience of institutions, the importance of experienced diplomacy, and the role of public engagement in shaping policy. He emphasizes that while disagreements are inevitable, they can also be productive when handled constructively. As he speaks, the audience begins to respond again, this time with a light but steady round of applause. It's not overwhelming, but it reflects an appreciation for the tone of his closing remarks. Colbert nods along, allowing Kerry to finish without interruption. When Kerry concludes, there's a brief pause, followed by a slightly stronger round of applause from the audience. The tension that had built earlier in the segment has eased, replaced by a sense of closure. Colbert offers a short acknowledgement, thanking Kerry for joining the show and for engaging in what he describes as a serious and necessary conversation. However, before fully transitioning away, Colbert adds one final comment, brief but notable. He reflects on the importance of having these discussions in public spaces, where different viewpoints can be heard and examined. His tone is calm, and there's no attempt to revisit earlier points of disagreement. Instead, it feels like a deliberate effort to end on a note of balance. Kerry responds with a nod and a brief smile, and the two exchange a handshake as the audience continues to applaud. The camera pulls back slightly, capturing the wider studio, where the energy has shifted back to what viewers would recognize as a typical late-night atmosphere, even if the conversation itself had been more serious than usual. As the show moves into its next segment, the immediate reaction inside the studio remains composed. Audience members are engaged, some still discussing quietly among themselves, while others settle back into their seats. There's no dramatic reaction, no visible division or disruption, but there is a sense that the conversation left an impression. After the episode airs, the discussion continues beyond the studio. Viewers begin sharing clips of the exchange across social media platforms, focusing on specific moments where the tone shifted or where key points were made. Some highlight Kerry's defense of diplomatic strategy, noting his emphasis on long-term stability and international cooperation. Others focus on Colbert's questions, particularly those that challenge the scope and effectiveness of past agreements. The response is varied, reflecting the complexity of the topic itself. Some viewers appreciate the calm and measured nature of the discussion, pointing out that it allowed for a more thoughtful exchange of ideas without resorting to confrontation. Others interpret certain moments as more pointed, noting the subtle tension that emerged as the conversation progressed. Commentary from political analysts and media outlets begins to appear as well, with many noting that the segment stood out not because of any dramatic clash, but because of how it handled disagreement. The conversation is described as an example of how late-night television can move beyond entertainment and into substantive discussion, while still maintaining a respectful tone. Clips of the interview circulate with captions emphasizing different aspects of the exchange. Some focus on Kerry's explanation of the nuclear deal and its intended impact, while others highlight Colbert's framing of the broader geopolitical context. The pauses, the shifts in tone, and the moments of careful wording all become points of discussion. In follow-up interviews and commentary, there is some clarification of points raised during the segment. Analysts revisit the timeline of U.S.-Iran relations, providing additional context for viewers who may not have been fully familiar with the details. Others discuss the challenges of addressing complex foreign policy issues within the limited time of a television segment. Neither Colbert nor Kerry revisits the exchange in a way that suggests lingering tension. Instead, the segment is treated as part of an ongoing public conversation, one that continues across different platforms and perspectives. The focus remains on the substance of what was discussed rather than on any personal disagreement. For many viewers, the segment serves as a reminder of how live television can capture moments that feel unscripted yet controlled, where differing viewpoints are presented without escalation. The absence of raised voices or overt conflict doesn't diminish the seriousness of the discussion. In fact, it underscores it. As the conversation continues online, some viewers express appreciation for the opportunity to hear a detailed explanation of policy decisions from someone directly involved, while others emphasize the importance of questioning those decisions, even in a late-night setting. The range of reactions reflects the broader public discourse, where agreement is not always the goal, but understanding can still be achieved. In the end, the segment is remembered less for any single moment and more for its overall tone. A steady, thoughtful exchange that allowed for disagreement without losing composure. It fits within the tradition of late-night interviews that occasionally step into more serious territory, offering viewers a different kind of engagement. And as the discussion gradually fades from immediate attention, it leaves behind a series of moments that viewers can revisit, reflect on, and interpret in their own way, whether they watched it live or encountered it later through clips and commentary. If you watched this exchange, or if you've seen the clips circulating online, share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Talk for more narration-based talk show stories.